February 22nd, 1797. A French invasion fleet appeared off the Welsh coast. 1,400 soldiers, 4 warships. Britain's shores undefended. This was it, the moment France had been waiting for. The chance to strike at the heart of the British Empire while the Royal Navy was distracted elsewhere. The French commander, an American Revolutionary War veteran, had orders to march inland, burn Bristol, and trigger a Welsh uprising against English rule. His men were battle-hardened troops, armed with modern muskets, supported by artillery. Facing them, a few dozen local militia, some elderly veterans, and the women of Pembrokeshire in their traditional red cloaks. This is the story of Fishguard, the last invasion of mainland Britain, the battle that wasn't really a battle, and the day when Welsh courage, French incompetence, and an absurd case of mistaken identity combined to create the most ridiculous military defeat in French history. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a forgotten invasion that reads like comedy but reveals something profound about British resilience. Because Fishguard wasn't won through superior tactics or overwhelming force. It was won through local courage, quick thinking, and the fact that sometimes your enemies defeat themselves. But before we get to those surrendering Frenchmen, before we watch Welsh women accidentally terrify an invasion force, we need to understand how France became so desperate that invading Wales with drunk convicts seemed like a good idea. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as Fishguard. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1797, when France was at war with most of Europe and losing badly. The French Revolution had executed King Louis XVI, terrified every monarchy in Europe, and triggered a massive coalition war. France faced Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and various Italian and German states. Essentially, everyone. By 1797, France had won on land through revolutionary fervor and brilliant generals like Napoleon Bonaparte, who was conquering Italy. But at sea, France was being strangled. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, intercepted French shipping, and made it impossible for France to feed its cities or supply its armies. France needed to hurt Britain, and hurt them badly. The French Directory, the government ruling France, approved a desperate plan: invade Britain directly, not with a massive army crossing the Channel, which the Royal Navy would destroy, but with small, fast raids that could slip past British defences, land on undefended coasts, and cause chaos before disappearing. The architect of this plan was General Lazare Hoche, one of France's most talented commanders. Hoche proposed 3 simultaneous raids on British shores. The main force would land in Ireland, where Catholic Irish rebels would supposedly rise up and join the French. Secondary forces would raid Scotland and Wales, spreading British defences thin and triggering panic. The Ireland invasion in December 1796 was a disaster. Storms scattered Hoche's fleet. Ships arrived at different times. The invasion force never landed, and the surviving vessels limped back to France. But the Directory wasn't finished. If they couldn't invade Ireland successfully, they'd raid Wales and prove that Britain was vulnerable. Command of the Welsh expedition went to an American, Colonel William Tate, Irish-American, veteran of the American Revolutionary War, now serving in the French army. Tate was 70 years old, partially deaf, spoke no French, and had no experience commanding large forces. Why did France choose him? Because this was a suicide mission, and nobody competent wanted it. Tate's army was even worse than its commander. The corps was La Légion Noire, the Black Legion, supposedly elite troops. In reality, they were convicts released from French prisons and given a choice: join the army or go back to jail. Many were criminals, deserters, and men who'd proven too unreliable for regular French units. They were given black uniforms, hence the name, minimal training, and shipped to Wales. Think about this for a moment. You're France in 1797. You're planning to invade Britain, the greatest naval power on earth, with the world's finest army. And you send 70-year-old American who doesn't speak French, commanding convicts in black uniforms, to raid Wales in February. Would you try to escape from it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. On February 16th, 1797, 4 French warships, La Vengeance, La Résistance, La Constance, and Vautour, sailed from Brest, carrying 1,400 men of the Black Legion, plus Colonel Tate. The mission: land somewhere on the British coast, preferably Wales, march inland, destroy property, spread terror, and trigger a Welsh uprising against English rule. The French believed the Welsh hated the English and would welcome French liberators. This was spectacularly wrong. While Wales had its grievances with London, nobody wanted French revolutionary troops, especially convict troops, burning their homes and stealing their livestock. The expedition immediately went wrong. The original target was Bristol, England's second-largest port. But winds were unfavourable. British vessels were spotted, and the French commander decided Bristol was too risky. New plan: land somewhere in Wales, anywhere, and hope for the best. On February 22nd, the French fleet appeared off the Welsh coast near Fishguard, a small port town in Pembrokeshire, southwest Wales. The commander, Commodore Jean-Joseph Castanier, wanted to land at Fishguard harbour itself. Tate refused. British resistance might be waiting. Instead, Tate chose Carreg Wastad Point, a rocky headland 3 miles west of Fishguard, defensible, remote, and far from any British forces. At 2 p.m. on February 22nd, French troops began landing. The sea was rough. Boats capsized. Equipment was lost. Men drowned. But by evening, 1,400 cold, wet, seasick soldiers of the Black Legion stood on British soil for the first time since 1066. They were armed with muskets, carried basic supplies, and had orders to march inland and cause maximum destruction. What they found instead was Welsh hospitality, in the form of several wrecked ships recently run aground on the Welsh coast. Their cargoes of Portuguese wine and brandy now scattered across the beaches. Remember, these were convicts, criminals, men with no loyalty to France or the mission. And suddenly they were on a cold Welsh beach with unlimited alcohol and nobody supervising them. What happened next was predictable. They got spectacularly drunk. Tate completely lost control. His officers tried to maintain discipline, but the Black Legion was more interested in Portuguese wine than invading Britain. Soldiers wandered off looking for more alcohol. Some broke into nearby farms stealing food and terrifying locals. Others simply collapsed on the beach, too drunk to march anywhere. Meanwhile, the locals were raising the alarm. A Welsh customs officer spotted the French landing and rode to Fishguard. By evening, church bells were ringing across Pembrokeshire. Messengers galloped toward larger towns. The alarm spread. The French have landed. The man who would save Wales was Lord Corder, local landowner, Lord Lieutenant of Pembrokeshire, and commander of the local militia. Corder was at home, miles from Fishguard, when news arrived. He immediately called up every militia unit, every volunteer, every man who could hold a musket. By the morning of February 23rd, Corder had assembled perhaps 500 men, farmers, shopkeepers, elderly veterans, even labourers armed with pitchforks. 500 militia against 1,400 French regular troops should have been a disaster. But Corder had advantages the French lacked. He knew the terrain. His men were defending their homes. And most importantly, the French were drunk, disorganized, and commanded by a 70-year-old who didn't speak their language. On February 23rd, the French finally began their invasion. Tate ordered his men to march toward Fishguard. Progress was chaos. Drunk soldiers stumbled along muddy Welsh roads. Supplies were abandoned. Several soldiers deserted immediately, disappearing into the Welsh countryside. The Black Legion was disintegrating before fighting a single battle. The French did manage one military success. They captured a farmhouse. Not through assault, the occupants had fled, but the French found more alcohol inside and stopped to drink it. Military historians rarely mention this detail, but it's true. France's last invasion of Britain was delayed because troops found more wine. Meanwhile, Corder's militia was assembling. 500 men doesn't sound impressive, but they were positioned well. Corder deployed them on high ground, overlooking the French positions, making his small force look larger. And here's where the story becomes legendary. The women of Pembrokeshire, watching French soldiers loot their farms and terrify their families, decided to help. Led by Jemima Nicholas, a 47-year-old cobbler who would become a Welsh folk hero, hundreds of local women marched to join the militia. They wore their traditional Welsh costume, tall black hats and long red woolen cloaks. From a distance, in misty Welsh weather, those red cloaks looked remarkably like British Army Redcoats. The French, already demoralized, drunk and lost, saw hundreds of soldiers in red uniforms gathering on the hills. They assumed British Army reinforcements had arrived. In reality, it was Welsh women armed with pitchforks, determination, and excellent taste in intimidating fashion. Colonel Tate looked at the hills surrounding his position. He saw British troops everywhere. He saw his men too drunk to fight. He saw Welsh civilians who clearly weren't going to rise up and join France. And he made a decision that would haunt French military pride for centuries. He surrendered. On February 24th, less than 48 hours after landing, Colonel Tate sent an officer to Lord Corder with a message. The French wished to negotiate terms. Corder, barely believing his luck, demanded unconditional surrender. Tate accepted. At 2 p.m. on February 24th, 1797, 1,400 French soldiers laid down their arms on Goodwick Sands Beach. They were surrounded by 500 Welsh militia and several hundred Welsh women, still wearing their red cloaks. The last invasion of Britain was over, not through battle, but through surrender to farmers and women in traditional dress. The French prisoners were marched to various British jails. Colonel Tate was interrogated about French invasion plans, provided useful intelligence, and eventually exchanged back to France, where he lived in quiet disgrace until his death in 1800. The Black Legion disappeared into British prisons. Many eventually released or exchanged. The warships that landed them escaped back to France. Their mission an absolute failure. Jemima Nicholas became a folk hero. According to legend, impossible to verify but too good not to tell, Nicholas personally captured 12 French soldiers using only a pitchfork. True or not, she received a government pension for her role in defending Wales. She's remembered today as Jemima IV, Jemima the Great, a symbol of Welsh courage and defiance. Lord Calder was rewarded with a promotion and national recognition. His tactical deployment, making 500 militia look like a larger force, was studied by military academicians. Though honestly, the credit belongs less to his tactics and more to French incompetence and Welsh women's red cloaks. But here's the fascinating part. Fishguard mattered far more than the absurd circumstances suggest. This was France's last serious attempt to invade mainland Britain. After Fishguard's humiliation, France abandoned direct invasion plans and focused on defeating Britain through continental alliances. Napoleon Bonaparte, learning from Fishguard's failure, would spend years assembling the largest invasion fleet since the Spanish Armada, only to abandon it after Trafalgar in 1805. Fishguard proved that Britain's coasts, even poorly defended ones, were harder to invade than France imagined. Local resistance, difficult terrain, and British determination meant that landing an army was easy. Supplying and supporting it was impossible. This lesson influenced French strategy for the rest of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. From a British perspective, Fishguard became a propaganda triumph. The nation that ruled the seas, that was fighting France across 3 continents, had been invaded and defeated the invaders in 48 hours using militia and women. It was proof that British courage existed at all levels of society, that ordinary people would defend their homeland, and that French revolutionary threats were hollow. The story was embellished over time. The number of Welsh women grew in the telling. Jemima Nicholas's 12 captured soldiers became dozens. The French became more drunk, more cowardly, more ridiculous with each retelling. But the core truth remained. A French invasion force had surrendered to civilians, and it was humiliating for France. For Wales specifically, Fishguard became a point of intense pride. While England had its great battles, Agincourt, Trafalgar, Waterloo, Wales had Fishguard, where Welsh courage and Welsh women had defeated France. It reinforced Welsh identity and proved that Wales was an integral, vital part of Britain's defence. The French, understandably, don't talk about Fishguard much. It's an embarrassing footnote in Revolutionary Wars history. French military histories focus on Napoleon's Italian campaigns, the victories at Rivoli and Arcole, the brilliant land warfare that was conquering Europe. Fishguard, an unfortunate incident involving convicts, bad weather, and poor planning. Best forgotten. But we shouldn't forget it, because Fishguard reveals something important about invasion attempts. Military power matters, yes, but logistics, discipline, and intelligence matter more. The French had soldiers and ships, but they sent the wrong soldiers, chose the wrong landing site, had no intelligence about local conditions, and completely misunderstood Welsh sentiment toward French liberation. Think about it. France's last invasion of Britain failed because drunk convicts stole wine, got lost on Welsh roads, and mistook women in red cloaks for professional soldiers. It's absurd. It's hilarious. But it's also a reminder that wars are won by logistics, discipline, and competent leadership, not just by having more guns. Modern Fishguard commemorates the invasion with a small museum and annual events recreating the landing. The Last Invasion Tapestry, created in 1997 for the bicentenary, depicts the invasion in 100 panels, a Welsh answer to the Bayeux Tapestry. Local pubs display memorabilia. Tourists visit Carreg Wastad Point, where the French landed. But the invasion's legacy extends beyond tourism. Fishguard proved Britain's islands were nearly impossible to invade, a lesson Hitler would rediscover in 1940 when Operation Sea Lion was cancelled. Coastal communities from Scotland to Cornwall gained confidence that locals could defend their homes until regular forces arrived. Jemima Nicholas's story, meanwhile, became part of British feminist history. A middle-aged female cobbler capturing soldiers with a pitchfork. It challenged Victorian assumptions about women's roles and celebrated female courage. Nicholas wasn't a noble lady or a historical queen. She was an ordinary working woman who became extraordinary in crisis. The French surrender at Fishguard also influenced British military planning. The government realized that militia and volunteer forces, properly organized, could effectively defend coasts against raids. This led to expanded militia programs, coastal fortifications, and volunteer societies, the foundations of Britain's Home Guard concept that would serve again in World Wars I and II. From a tactical perspective, Fishguard demonstrated that amphibious landings were incredibly difficult without proper planning. The French had landing craft, troops, and supplies, but without secured supply lines, reliable intelligence, or proper command structure, the invasion collapsed within hours. Modern military strategists studying amphibious operations still note Fishguard as a cautionary tale about what not to do. There's also a strange what if to consider. What if the French had succeeded? What if they'd landed at Bristol as planned, burned the docks, and escaped before British forces responded? The psychological impact would have been devastating. Bristol was Britain's second city. If France could raid it with impunity, nowhere was safe. But they failed spectacularly, and that failure convinced France that raiding Britain was pointless. Better to focus resources on continental campaigns where French armies excelled. Fishguard inadvertently protected Britain from future raids by making such operations look hopeless. Today, Fishguard is a peaceful Welsh harbour town. Ferries depart for Ireland. Tourists enjoy the coastal scenery. The beaches where French soldiers landed drunk are now popular with families. There's nothing to suggest this quiet town was once the site of the last foreign invasion of mainland Britain. But walk the coastal paths where Corder's militia assembled. Stand on the hills where Welsh women in red cloaks gathered. Look out at Carreg Wastad Point, where 1,400 French soldiers stumbled ashore. The history is there, embedded in the landscape, remembered by locals, and celebrated as a moment of Welsh courage and French folly. The invasion also produced one of history's great ironies: the French Revolutionary Army, which had conquered much of Europe, which had defeated Austria and Prussia, which would soon follow Napoleon to victories across the continent. This army surrendered to Welsh women because they mistook red cloaks for red coats. You can't make this up. It's too absurd. But it's history. If there's a lesson from Fishguard, it's this: never underestimate local resistance. Never assume invasions will be easy. Never send drunk convicts to invade Britain. And most importantly, never underestimate Welsh women in red cloaks. Fishguard stands as perhaps the most British victory ever, won not through military brilliance, but through local courage, enemy incompetence, and the happy accident that Welsh traditional dress resembles British Army uniforms. It's not Waterloo, it's not Trafalgar, but it's uniquely, gloriously, absurdly British. A victory that shouldn't have worked, but did, against an invasion that should have been terrifying, but was merely embarrassing. And that, ultimately, is why Fishguard matters. It reminds us that history isn't just about great generals and epic battles. Sometimes it's about Welsh women with pitchforks, French convicts drunk on Portuguese wine, and a 70-year-old American colonel who surrendered an invasion force because he saw red cloaks on a hill. This is the story of Fishguard, the last invasion of Britain, the victory won by mistake, and the day when Wales proved that courage, quick thinking, and really excellent traditional fashion could defeat an empire. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the absurd victories, the impossible defenses, the moments when everything went wrong for someone and right for Britain, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other ridiculous British victories should we cover? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.